Under the shimmering crystal chandeliers of the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco, everything looked perfect. Too perfect. The clinking of champagne glasses, the harmonious quartet playing Bach in the background, and the air thick with prestige and admiration painted the kind of picture people would kill to be a part of. But behind the polished smiles and expertly tailored tuxedos, a storm had already started brewing, a storm I hadn't yet seen coming. Not until it was far too late. They say the greatest betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from the ones who sleep beside you. I was Elena Whitmore, neurologist, wife, mother. And up until that night, a woman who believed she had the kind of life most people envy. My husband, Charles, was the epitome of charm and success. Chief oncologist at one of California's leading hospitals, keynote speaker at global conferences, and the kind of man who drew people in like gravity. We had built our careers, our legacy, and most importantly, our family together. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, the rehearsal dinner before our daughter Sophia's wedding. The ballroom glowed in candlelight as guests from Harvard, Stanford, and the Mayo Clinic mingled like minor royalty. The scent of white gardenias filled the air, flown in from Brazil because Sophia had once admired them in a magazine spread. Everything had been curated to the last detail, including, I thought, our life. I was wrong. My daughter looked radiant. My son, Henry, had returned from New York with stories of startup pitches and coffee-fueled hackathons. Guests toasted our unshakable family values. And Charles was making the rounds as usual, flashing that dazzling smile, patting shoulders, charming our guests like a practiced politician. But it was when I saw him lingering too long at the edge of the dance floor, whispering into the ear of Isabel, his assistant, that something inside me shifted. Her laugh, his hand on the small of her back. A softness in their eyes that didn't belong in a professional relationship. I brushed it off at first. Tell me it's nothing, I told myself. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was just my nerves. But then, the whisper. A sentence that sliced through the background noise like a scalpel. She has no idea. She never will. Not until it's too late. I heard it. Clear as crystal. Spoken in Charles's voice, barely masked by the bass line of the quartet's music. Isabel gave a low, knowing chuckle. I stood frozen behind a column, concealed in the shadows, the blood draining from my face. And just like that, the illusion shattered. I had spent my life mapping the brain, understanding how trauma rewires identity, how memory holds secrets in the folds of neurons. But nothing in neuroscience prepared me for the gut punch of realizing your entire marriage might be a carefully curated lie. Nothing taught me how to breathe through the immediate, crushing weight of doubt that settles in your chest when you see the man you built your world with become a stranger in front of your eyes. I walked back into the ballroom, smiling for the cameras, clinking glasses with donors and board members. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The part of me that trusted Charles died that night, quietly, without announcement, but completely. What followed was a descent into questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered, but I had to know. Because if I was going to fall apart, I wanted to know exactly what had dismantled me. The thing about betrayal is, it's rarely accidental. It's architectural, built slowly, in secret, with precision. And as I would come to discover, Charles had been an architect of deception for years. Not weeks, not months, years. And it was far worse than I ever imagined. But I wouldn't confront him that night. No. I waited. I observed. I listened to the micro-expressions in his face, the pattern of his excuses, the tone he used when Isabel's name was mentioned. I kept smiling, playing the doting wife, waiting for the right moment. Because I knew now, I wasn't just looking at a man who had a secret. I was living beside a man who had built a second life. and I wasn't the only one who had been fooled. Want to share this story with you, not as a victim, but as a surgeon. Someone trained in precision. Someone who understands that when there is diseased tissue inside a living system, the only cure is removal. You cannot negotiate with rot. You excise it. This story is about betrayal, yes, but it's also about strategy, about understanding the anatomy of lies and using truth like a scalpel. It's about surgical revenge, calculated, irreversible, and devastating. But don't worry, this story won't just make your blood boil. It'll make you sit up straight. It'll make you question everything. It might even make you stronger, and believe me, you'll want to stay until the end, because when the truth comes out, it doesn't knock. It explodes. If stories like this grip you, if you believe betrayal should never be met with silence, subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue creating bold, emotional stories that speak truth to lies, and help others heal by watching justice unfold. Now, before we dive into part 2, I've got a quick question for you. If you heard your partner whisper, "She has no idea. She never will. Not until it's too late." At a party, would you? A. Pretend you didn't hear it and wait for more clues? B. Confront them right then and there in front of everyone? Drop your answer in the comments below. A or B, and let's see how many of you are calm observers, and how many would blow it up right then and there. Get ready. The next part of this story is when everything falls apart, and then gets put back together. Not how anyone expected. The days after the rehearsal dinner passed in a blur of orchestrated beauty and buried dread. No one else could tell. On the surface, I remained Dr. Elena Whitmore, accomplished neurologist, doting mother, poised host. But internally, my world had begun to fracture, layer by layer, thought by thought. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a pattern, a scent, a string of late-night absences that never made sense. And once your mind begins to question reality, every smile becomes a mask, every moment becomes a clue. Charles continued to act as though nothing had changed. He laughed in his signature low tone, touched my shoulder when speaking to friends, and made toasts with the charm of a seasoned diplomat. But I noticed his gaze always found Isabel across the room. The quick, almost imperceptible check-ins. The small texts he'd delete quickly after reading them. It wasn't just attraction. It was familiarity. The intimacy of two people who had long since stopped needing to pretend when they were alone. I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Not yet. Because this wasn't just about one betrayal. My gut told me it went deeper. So I did what I had trained my mind for my entire life. I observed. I gathered data. I remained calm. This was no longer my marriage. It was a case. And I was the lead investigator. My first call was to Naomi Castillo, my attorney and longtime friend. Naomi had handled our estate planning over the years, knew every legal inch of our assets, trusts, and holdings. I told her what I had overheard and what I suspected. She didn't respond with shock. Instead, she said one word. Document. Next, I reached out to Victor Cheng, a former cybersecurity analyst turned private digital investigator. We had worked together on a medical ethics case involving data manipulation. He was quiet, precise, and never asked unnecessary questions. I gave him a simple instruction. I want to know everything, and I don't want anyone to know you're looking. Victor began with Charles's email backups, his cloud storage, then traced financial activity across our accounts. What came back wasn't just infidelity. It was a life I never even knew existed. Charles had purchased a villa in Positano, Italy, 5 years ago. It was under a trust name, with its ownership cleverly laundered through a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The villa was not a vacation home. It was lived in, maintained regularly, stocked with luxury linens and children's toys. Children. There were photos. Dozens of them. Charles with a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful in a raw, unpolished way, Italian perhaps. In the pictures, they looked like a family. Her, Charles, and a young girl, maybe 7 years old. A little boy, no older than 3, clung to Charles's leg in one photo. My heart stopped. Victor had traced school tuition payments, medical records, even birthday party bookings. The woman's name was Alessia Marino. She had once been a translator for a medical conference in Rome where Charles was the keynote speaker. The timeline made sense, if any of it could make sense. He hadn't just had an affair. He had built a second family. I stared at the photos on my screen in my office at home. Same Charles, same watch I had gifted him on our 20th anniversary, same laugh lines at the corners of his eyes. But a different world, one I had never been invited into, one he had kept alive while coming home to me every night. I had spent decades believing we were partners. We had navigated crises together, lost a child together, rebuilt a life with meaning. I thought we shared everything, but he had looked me in the eye for 5 years and lied without flinching. That was the part I couldn't reconcile. It wasn't just the cheating, it was the skill, the ease. The years of deception that required planning, intent, and daily choices to hide the truth. I began cross-referencing everything, his travel, his excuses, the times he claimed he was in New York for research or at conferences. Most of them were half-truths. He'd gone to conferences, but then he'd taken short flights to Naples, rented cars under aliases, stayed at the villa for days at a time, sometimes over holidays. Victor found messages that chilled me. Not just to Alessia, but to Isabel. The 3 of them had a kind of coded communication. It was clear now. Isabel wasn't just a mistress. She was part of the structure. She helped manage the lie, booked fake appointments, intercepted travel, confirmations, even covered for him with staff at the hospital. She was complicit, fully. And worst of all, she had been sitting at my dinner table more than once. Charles had, without my knowledge, sold off stocks we had acquired together to fund tuition payments for his other daughter. And he had done so, through accounts only he could access. Accounts I had signed off on years ago, in good faith, trusting that our family's financial security was being preserved. Naomi and I met late one night in her office overlooking the Embarcadero. I sat in silence as she reviewed the full scope of what we had uncovered. When she finished, she looked up slowly and said, "This isn't just betrayal, Elena. This is calculated fraud, and we're going to make sure he feels every inch of it." We laid out a 3-phase plan. I called it Project Phoenix. Phase 1, documentation. We would collect every piece of evidence, emails, photos, account transfers, and DNA tests. Victor handled the latter. He had retrieved a used coffee cup from Isabel's office trash. It didn't take much to confirm what I feared. The little girl in the Italian villa was Charles's biological daughter, my children's half-sister. Sophia and Henry had no idea. Phase 2, legal positioning. Naomi activated international protocols we had only ever used for high-risk malpractice settlements. We began repositioning assets, legal and financial maneuvers, that Charles wouldn't detect until it was too late. I used his own arrogance against him. The man never thought I would move first. He assumed, like always, that I would fall in line. And then came Phase 3, strategy. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about exposure and timing. Sophia's wedding was in 5 days. I wasn't going to ruin her wedding. I was going to cancel it. But not with a whisper, with thunder. I wanted everyone to know who Charles Whitmore really was, what he had done, how long he had done it. Because people like Charles don't just lie to their families. They lie to entire communities. They build their reputations on myths, powered by silence. In the meantime, I played my part. I kissed him. Good night. I asked him about his day. I let him believe I was distracted with last-minute wedding details. I smiled at Isabel when we crossed paths in the hospital hallway. I let them both think they had outplayed me, but I was already assembling. The folders. I was printing transcripts, organizing files, preparing USB drives. Every wedding guest would receive one, along with a letter. I remember standing in my bedroom, looking at a photo of Charles holding Sophia as a baby. I had loved him then, with everything I had. And now I would dismantle him. Not because I wanted vengeance, but because I needed clarity. Because he had rewritten our story behind my back. And I was going to reclaim the truth, page by page. And most importantly, I wasn't doing it for myself alone. I was doing it for Sophia, for Henry, for the people who still believed in the image he had sold them. They deserved to see who he really was. I sat in my office that night, staring at the screensaver on my monitor, watching waves crash against the cliffs of Big Sur. I had always found those cliffs beautiful, not because they were soft or inviting, but because they stood unbroken. I would be like those cliffs. He could crash against me all he wanted, but I would not move. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about awakening. The moment a woman stops asking why and starts asking, how do I rebuild? It's the story of what happens when someone trained to heal. The brain uses that same discipline to cut away the lies that tried to rot her soul. And believe me, I was just getting started. Coming up in the next chapter, what happens when every guest at the wedding of the year receives a truth bomb instead of a party favor? And how the exposure of one man's double life rippled through an entire institution. You won't want to miss what happens when the masks fall. The morning of Sophia's wedding dawned clear and golden, the kind of California spring day that seems to promise everything will go exactly as planned. Grace Cathedral stood like a sentinel on the hill, wrapped in light and floral arrangements, its grand staircase waiting for silk trains and high heels. Guests began arriving before 7 a.m., dressed in bespoke suits and custom gowns, ready for what the society pages had already dubbed the Union of Medicine and Legacy. But beneath the surface of that meticulously planned event, something far more powerful was taking shape. Something irreversible. I had barely slept. Not out of anxiety, but out of focus. The kind of calm that only comes when you've already made peace with what must be done. Charles was still asleep when I left. The suite. His arm flung across the duvet like a man without a care in the world. I had watched him for a moment in the dark, wondering if there was a version of him, perhaps buried, perhaps long gone, that once deserved the love I had poured into him. But then I remembered the photos, the child, the whispers, and I walked, out without hesitation. The cathedral's wedding coordinator, Marie Chen, greeted me with her usual graceful efficiency. I handed her a sealed box, gave her instructions, and left no room for questions. Inside the box were dozens of smaller ivory boxes, each one perfectly tied with silk ribbon. Inside each of those, a personalized letter from me and a USB drive. Victor had ensured that the drives would be read-only, uneditable. Each contained organized folders labeled with brutal clarity. DNA tests, financial transfers, email transcripts, villa photos, legal notices. Every folder was clean, precise, damning. The truth, in full view. The letters were handwritten, one for each guest. Some were warm, others blunt. Each one acknowledged the person's role in our lives, family, friend, colleague, and laid out what they had never seen. The truth about Charles Whitmore. By 8 a.m., a hush had started to spread across the cathedral steps. Guests arriving found themselves greeted not by flower girls, but by ushers distributing the gift boxes. Confusion turned to silence, then to whispers, then to gasps. I watched from the cathedral's west alcove, unseen, while the layers of illusion peeled away in real time. William Carter, Charles's mentor and former board chair of our hospital, stood frozen with his mouth slightly open, reading the letter as his wife pulled the USB drive from its bed of Jordan almonds. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from recognition. Next to him, Sophia's future in-laws stared at a screen one of their nephews had connected to his laptop. Images of Charles holding Alessia's daughter, his other daughter, flickered across the screen. Financial ledgers with Charles's signature appeared. Correspondence between Isabel and Charles discussing making sure the other family doesn't crosswires. I had debated whether to spare Sophia, whether to tell her quietly the night before, woman to woman, mother to daughter, but I knew her. Sophia was brilliant, but she had inherited her father's pride. She needed to see it the way everyone else did. Raw, undeniable, public. And she would. Soon. At 8:30 a.m., Charles arrived at the cathedral, dressed in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, confident as ever. I watched him stop at the bottom of the cathedral stairs, confusion slowly crawling into his features as he noticed the clusters of guests whispering, huddled, pointing. He spotted William, tried to approach him, but the man turned away. Then, he saw me, standing beneath the rose window. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I simply nodded. That was when the first crack appeared in his facade. The beginning of his end. Sophia arrived just moments later in her wedding gown, glowing and laughing, until she wasn't. Her best friend ran up to her, phone in hand. Sophia stopped walking. Her veil still over her face, she stared at the screen. I knew the exact moment she saw the photo of Charles and the child because she dropped her bouquet. The lilies scattered at her feet like broken glass. She ran inside, followed by Henry. I waited. Charles stormed into the cathedral, demanding answers. His voice echoed across the vaulted ceilings. "What the hell is going on, Elena?" He found me by the altar, where I had spent hours rehearsing her ceremony in my mind. I turned slowly, holding the same expression I'd use for a colleague lying under oath at a peer review hearing. "It's all true," I said. He shook his head, stammering. "You don't understand," I raised a hand. "You had 5 years to explain. This morning is for listening." He didn't move. He looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into a surgical suite with the wrong patient file. Unprepared. Outmatched. From the back of the cathedral, the hospital's legal counsel entered. Naomi followed behind her, already pulling documents from her briefcase. Divorce proceedings, asset transfer confirmations, board review requests. Everything was already moving. Charles was still trying to find footing when Sophia stormed down the aisle toward him. She looked radiant even, in fury. "Tell me it's not true," she demanded. "Tell me that little girl isn't my half-sister. Tell me Isabel isn't part of this." He reached for her hand. "Sophia, listen." She pulled away. "I heard them talking. In the video. They called her your firstborn. I'm not even your firstborn." The air in the cathedral felt suffocating, dense with truth. Henry, ever quiet, stood at a distance, shaking his head. "All those years," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. "All those times you told me to be a man of integrity." Marie appeared at my side, her voice low. "Should we cancel the ceremony?" "No," I said. "We've already held the only ceremony that matters." Charles tried once more. "Elena, we can fix this." Naomi cut him off, handing him an envelope. "Dr. Whitmore, these are the terms of divorce. As you'll see, the European holdings have been frozen. The villa is being transferred to the Italian courts pending fraud investigation. Your accounts under Alessia's name have been flagged for review. Isabel's license is under emergency suspension." He opened the envelope. With shaking hands, flipping through the pages. "You can't take everything." "You took everything," I replied. "I'm just putting it back in the right hands." By mid-morning, the press had arrived. Word of the scandal had reached the local papers through anonymous tips. Photographers snapped photos of guests leaving, of the bride in tears, of Charles, being escorted by his own legal team out of the cathedral's side entrance. Inside, I sat with Sophia in the bridal suite. Her makeup was smeared, her voice raw. "Did you know?" she asked me. I suspected. I answered honestly. And when I knew, I made sure the world would know too. She leaned her head on my shoulder and cried like she hadn't in years, not the tears of a broken heart, but of a fractured identity. We sat there until her breathing slowed. "You ended your marriage today," she whispered. "No," I said. "He ended it 5 years ago. I just finished the procedure." That night, the cathedral stood empty. The flowers wilted, the programs left unread. But something else had bloomed in their place. Truth. And like any honest incision, it stung before it healed. Charles would go home to silence. His career would unravel in the coming weeks. The board would request his resignation. Isabel would flee to Europe and face scrutiny there. Alessia's quiet life would be interrupted by depositions and child support claims. And Sophia, my Sophia, would rebuild, but on solid ground this time. As for me, I slept alone that night for the first time in 27 years. And for the first time in just as long, I didn't feel alone at all, because I had told the truth, and the truth had finally answered back. The year that followed the canceled wedding unfolded not as a tragedy, but as a rebirth. The silence that replaced chaos was not empty, but intentional. A silence that allowed growth, healing, and clarity to emerge in its place. What many assumed would be my fall became the foundation of something far greater than revenge. It became the beginning of a new legacy. I moved to Oxford 6 months after the cathedral scandal. The university had offered me a position as Dean of Medical Ethics, a role I had once considered too far removed from clinical practice. But after the events of the previous year, I realized that ethics was no longer theoretical for me. It had become personal. Ethics wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about lived experience, about how systems and silences could be used to hide rot in the most polished institutions. I accepted the offer not because I needed a new title, but because I needed to build something that would outlast the wreckage Charles left behind. Oxford was different. It was slower, quieter, and rich with thoughtful minds who didn't care what foundation galas I'd attended or whose daughter I was raising. It was a place where substance outweighed performance. I found solace in its rain, in the long walks across cobblestone quads, in lectures delivered under centuries-old arches. I found myself again in the pages of the curriculum I rewrote from the ground up, inserting real-world case studies, not just hypotheticals. My story, without names, became part of the coursework. And soon, something larger emerged from it. The Whitmore Integrity Fellowship. I debated the name. Using the surname that had once stood beside Betrayal seemed strange. But then I remembered that legacy is not fixed. It is rewritten. And I had every right to reshape it. The fellowship was established for medical students from underrepresented or overlooked backgrounds, those who had experienced the weight of compromise, the pressure of moral erosion. It offered full tuition, mentorship, and required one thesis, a real-life account of an ethical dilemma and the student's role in navigating it. Not theory, truth. The first cohort arrived that fall. I remember standing at the door of the lecture hall, watching them file in, brilliant, wide-eyed, cautious, and already weary of a system that demanded perfection while hiding imperfection at its highest levels. These weren't just students. They were future disruptors. I wasn't just teaching them to be doctors. I was teaching them to be witnesses. Back in San Francisco, the ripples of truth had not stopped moving. Charles was no longer at UCSF. He had been quietly removed from the hospital board after the internal ethics review concluded. Though they never released a public statement, the damage was done. Word spread. Hospitals that had once begged him for keynote addresses now avoided his name entirely. Medical journals rescinded co-authorships. Private institutions declined his applications for speaking engagements. He had become a cautionary tale. Isabel, after being suspended by the California Medical Board, fled to Switzerland. For a time, she worked under aliases in unregulated telemedicine firms. But even in those dark corners of medicine, her name began to show up on watch lists. Her past clung to her like a shadow, one that would never let her step fully back into the light. As for Alessia, I made no move against her. She was never the architect, only a chapter in Charles's secret life. Legal proceedings around custody and child support began, initiated by Charles himself, an effort, perhaps, to salvage what remained of his role in that child's life. I stayed out of it, not because I forgave, but because some battles are not mine to fight. My children each found their own way through the ruins. Sophia left San Francisco 2 months after the wedding fallout. She moved to Singapore, taking a position with an NGO focused on women's health and empowerment in Southeast Asia. It was there that she rebuilt herself, not as the daughter of scandal, but as an advocate for women whose stories often went unheard. In one of our calls, she said something that stuck with me. "You broke the silence so I could find my voice." Her words humbled me. She had always been strong, but now she was grounded, no longer building her life around the approval of anyone's name, especially not her father's. Henry, always quieter, found himself in a different way. He began developing an app centered on emotional resilience and mental wellness for young adults, drawing on his own experiences of betrayal and identity crisis. His platform, True North, gained early traction and secured angel investors from the very communities that had once funded our gala events. But now, the money was going somewhere meaningful. He turned pain into product, and in doing so, helped others turn confusion into clarity. At Oxford, I met someone I hadn't expected. Dr. Amir Dastan was a visiting lecturer from Tehran, a neurologist who had transitioned into mindfulness research and wrote widely on the intersection of trauma and healing. He had read one of my published case studies, again, anonymized, but recognized the humanity behind it. Our conversations began over coffee, evolved into late walks through Christchurch Meadow, and soon became something far more intimate. Amir didn't try to rescue me. He didn't pity me. He listened. And in his listening, I felt seen, not as the woman who had been wronged, but as the woman who had risen. Our relationship wasn't dramatic or fast-burning. It was slow, respectful, and deeply rooted in truth. We shared journals, arguments, poetry. We debated neuroscience and moral philosophy over tea. When he told me he loved me, he did so not in a grand gesture, but in a quiet moment after I had finished lecturing a class on narrative medicine. "I love you," he said, "because you teach people to see the truth, even when it hurts." I didn't cry. I just nodded. Because what do you say when someone finally names you without erasing you? Eventually, he moved to Oxford permanently, taking a position in the university's Mindfulness Research Center. We made no declarations of marriage, no formal promises. Just a life built together, not in the ashes of something else, but in the soil of something new. The Whitmore Integrity Fellowship expanded into a foundation within 2 years. We launched research grants, medical ethics scholarships across multiple continents, and a virtual curriculum accessible to hospitals and universities around the world. The case that started it all, my case, was now a central module in the Bondig Truth in Medicine series, studied not for the scandal but for the recovery, the rebirth, the choice to rebuild instead of retaliate. I never chased revenge after the wedding. I didn't need to. The truth, once exposed, does what revenge never can. It regenerates. 10 months after I moved to Oxford, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside, a single sentence, written in Charles's handwriting. I see it now. That was it. No apology, no explanation. But in some small way, it was confirmation that the mirror I held up had finally reflected back into him. Whether it changed anything, I didn't care. It wasn't about him anymore. The year passed in cycles of creation, of expansion. My life no longer felt like a fortress built for protection. It felt like a house with open doors, filled with students, laughter, research, and hard, real conversations. I once believed that betrayal was the end of a life, but I now know it's only the end of the illusion. The beginning, true beginning, starts the moment you decide to tell your story, without shame, without fear, and without waiting for someone else to confirm it. Sophia, Henry, and I now speak, every Sunday. Sometimes it's brief, sometimes we laugh for hours, sometimes we remember, not out of pain, but to remind ourselves how far we've come. And every time I stand in front of a lecture hall, I begin the same way. I'm not here to teach you how to be perfect. I'm here to teach you how to be honest. Because the truth will cost you something, but silence, it'll cost you everything. And somehow, in that honesty, we all begin again. 10 years had passed since the day truth shattered the illusion of my marriage, my family, and everything I once believed was solid. A decade can seem like a long time until you're living in the aftermath of betrayal. Then it becomes something else entirely. Not a passage of time, but a testament to survival, to transformation, and most of all, to legacy. I stood at the podium inside the newly renovated main auditorium of UCSF Medical Center, the same institution where Charles once gave lectures that captivated rooms and secured funding. But today, the crowd was not here for him. Today, the space belonged to something else, something honest. It was the 10th anniversary of the Whitmore Integrity Foundation, and I had been asked to deliver the keynote address at the hospital's Global Medical Ethics Symposium. The irony was not lost on me. This institution, which had once turned its gaze away from quiet corruption, now welcomed an entire generation of professionals devoted to ensuring no such silence would ever take root again. The room was filled with students, ethicists, administrators, clinicians, and foundation scholars. Among them, in the front row, sat Henry and Sophia, grown now, steady, transformed. Henry had launched his second startup by then, a mental health platform built not around perfection, but around emotional truth. Sophia had returned from Singapore and now ran a nonprofit in New York that supported women whose careers had been derailed by domestic deception and control. Their paths had diverged in geography, but converged in mission, clarity, dignity, and responsibility. The moment I took the stage, the room quieted. I didn't need slides or a dramatic opening line. I simply began with the same words I had once spoken quietly in a classroom at Oxford. Integrity, I said, is not about appearing righteous. It's about remaining accountable. When one is watching, when no one will reward you for it, and especially when telling the truth threatens to break everything you've built. As I spoke, I watched faces in the audience shift. Some softened, some hardened. It was the same response I had come to expect when people heard the full weight of my story, not the scandal, not the betrayal, but what followed. The quiet rebuilding. The decision to lead from transparency, not bitterness. The symposium ended with a standing ovation, not just for me, but for what the foundation had created. Over 200 scholarship recipients across 30 countries, countless hospital reforms, whistleblower protections, and mandatory ethics training programs shaped by our work. We had become more than a story. We had become a safeguard. Later that evening, back at our foundation office in Dublin, I sat beside Amir, who had since taken over as Director of Global Research Initiatives. His hand rested gently over mine as we reviewed the newest round of scholarship applications. Among them was one that stopped me in my tracks. It was from Reina Marino, the daughter Charles had fathered with Alessia, the child I had first seen only in photographs, the little girl who had once represented the final knife to my heart. Now she was a young woman. Her personal statement was elegant, raw, and brimming with awareness far beyond her years. "I grew up surrounded by silence," she wrote. "But I want to spend my life in rooms where truth is spoken, even when it's hard." She didn't mention Charles by name. She didn't have to. Her words were the echo of a lineage she had never asked for but chose to reframe. I placed her application in the accepted pile without hesitation. Not because of who her father was, but because of who she had chosen to become. Back in the United States, the remnants of the man who once deceived us all had nearly vanished from public view. Charles had retreated from the professional world long ago. His medical license was never formally revoked, but no hospital dared employ him. The Foundation's internal investigations had been shared widely. The whispers turned into public record. His legacy had not been erased. It had simply been revised, accurately, to reflect the truth. The prestigious man who once commanded rooms, with charm, now lived alone in a modest apartment in the Bronx, funded by a pension reduced by legal settlements and overdue child support. He had reached out only once more, 5 years after the scandal. A single envelope arrived at our Dublin office, with no return address. Inside was his medical diploma, and a short note scrawled beneath the name he no longer signed with pride. "For your Museum of Truth, let them learn from me." We placed the diploma inside a glass case at our Ethics Center in Oxford. Alongside it sat Isabel's suspended license, redacted documents from whistleblowers we had protected, and photos from the day of the canceled wedding. A timeline of what happens when lies go unchecked, and how courage can bring accountability. Lorraine, his longtime co-conspirator, the woman who had once walked the gala circuit on his arm, fared no better. Her professional licenses had been quietly surrendered after evidence surfaced that she had falsified patient records to help Charles maintain his double life. For a while, she worked as a receptionist in a budget clinic outside Sacramento, her name removed from every professional registry. Eventually, she disappeared from public life entirely. No interviews, no defenses. Just absence. Their love affair, if you could call it that, had ended not in drama, but in cold, slow erosion. Two people bound not by affection, but by the quiet terror of exposure. And once that exposure came, they had nothing left to bind them. 1 week after the symposium, I received a video message from Sophia. She had been invited to deliver a talk at Columbia, where she used our story, our real story, as a framework for identifying psychological grooming in long-term relationships. In the video, she stood poised, strong, and free. She closed her speech with a sentence I recognized as my own. "My mother taught me that truth is the most painful scalpel you'll ever hold. But if you use it well, it will save your life." Henry sent a clip too, footage of a training program being rolled out in schools across California, teaching emotional literacy to young people. He had named one module the Mirror Principle, a lesson in how to spot deception and how to recognize it within yourself. And me? I had everything I needed, not in revenge, not in public triumphs, but in the quiet assurance that I had built something no one could take away. Legacy. A legacy not defined by betrayal, but by what rose from it. That evening, as the city lights shimmered over the River Liffey, Amir and I walked home hand in hand from our favorite cafe. Dublin had become home, not just for us, but for an idea. That from devastation, we could craft design. That from loss, we could shape language. That from silence, we could build a truth that did not apologize for itself. Before bed, I opened Raina's email again and read her closing line. I want to prove that where we come from is not where we must remain. And I thought, yes, that is the truth. Because in the end, the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's creation. It's building something so honest, so untouchable, so deeply rooted in purpose, that even the deepest betrayal becomes a seed for something indestructible. And I had done just that, with no apology, with no regret, only truth, and the life it had made possible. In the end, the story of Dr. Elena Whitmore is not a tale of heartbreak. It's a story of radical transformation. A journey that begins in the polished marble halls of privilege, through the quiet violence of betrayal, and rises, brilliantly, into a life redefined by truth, intention, and legacy. Elena began as so many do, believing in the world she had, built with her husband, Charles. A world built on hard work, sacrifice, shared dreams, and the illusion of safety. But beneath that polished exterior, another truth was forming. One her husband had been constructing in the shadows for years. A secret family, a second life, a double betrayal. When the mask was ripped off, Elena could have collapsed. She could have played the victim, lashed out publicly, or disappeared into shame. But she didn't. She did what only a woman with unwavering clarity could do. She stood still. She listened. She documented. And then she acted. With surgical precision, both literal and metaphorical, Elena executed a quiet, dignified, and devastating response. Not to punish, but to reveal. She didn't just expose Charles to their community. She exposed the entire architecture of deception he had built. She didn't destroy him. She removed him, like diseased tissue from an otherwise healthy system. And then she did something even more rare. She didn't stop at survival. She created something better. From the ashes of that betrayal, she built the Whitmore Integrity Foundation, a global force for ethical medicine. She became a teacher, a mentor, a reformer. She raised 2 children who refused to let their identity be shaped by their father's failures. She found love again, not in drama, but in quiet alignment, with a man who saw her not as broken, but as whole. And perhaps most powerful of all, she rewrote her story not to hide her pain, but to give others the language to face theirs. The lesson here is not about revenge. It's about choice. You do not get to choose whether life will betray you. But you always get to choose what you become after it does. Elena's story teaches us that there is no shame in being deceived. The shame belongs to those who create lies, not the ones who trusted too deeply. But there is a quiet power in seeing clearly, and in responding with integrity rather than vengeance. In today's world, where betrayal can come in so many forms, at work, in love, in institutions, we must learn to recognize the red flags early. But even more importantly, we must learn how to rebuild without bitterness. We apply this story by asking better questions. Who am I when everything I trusted falls apart? What values will I hold even when no one's watching? Will I mirror the darkness that harmed me? Or will I rise above it? You don't have to start a global foundation to live with integrity. Sometimes it means setting a boundary, leaving a relationship, protecting your children from toxic legacies, telling your truth out loud, or simply choosing not to carry someone else's shame anymore. Elena did all those things. And in doing so, she showed us that the most powerful revenge is not destruction, it is creation. Creating a life so grounded in honesty, so firm in principle, that even your worst chapter becomes part of your legacy. Her story reminds us that healing isn't a return to who you were. It's becoming someone stronger because of what you've endured. That's what makes her story unforgettable, and that's what makes it universal. Now let me ask you, if you discovered that someone close to you had been living a double life for years, would you, A, confront them immediately, driven by emotion and instinct? B. Pause, gather evidence, and build a long-term plan for truth and accountability? Comment your answer below, A or B, and let's see how many of you would act fast and how many would move with quiet strategy like Elena did. And now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Elena's place? Would you have exposed everything like she did? Do you believe in public accountability or private closure? Let's open up the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments so we can all learn from each other's perspectives. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about betrayal and justice, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us create more stories like this. Stories that go beyond the surface and speak directly to the heart. Thank you for being here. This is just the beginning.